My name is Neil. I pastor City Church. We've been meeting in Edgbaston in Birmingham for 18 years, and we've been meeting here at St Martin's for what we call Second City, our afternoon congregation, for just over a year. It's great to have you here, and a happy New Year to you as well. We're starting a new series, and we've given it the title "Eternity Changes Everything." There's the graphic that's going to go with us through the rest of this term. And I want to start just by asking us to think a little bit about the topic of what we call present bias. Present bias. And I don't mean a bias for presents at Christmas. I mean present as in today over against tomorrow. Now, I think it goes without saying, doesn't it, that we all think we'd rather have a bigger reward than a smaller reward. Everyone wants that. A bigger reward rather than a smaller reward goes without saying. That's common sense. But it's less obvious that it's a very human response to prefer an instant reward from a delayed one. And that isn't always a logical conclusion, according to psychologists and economists and so on. And that's what they call present bias. I'd rather have something today than something more tomorrow. And the way it generally works is that the further away a reward is, in other words, the longer we have to wait for it, the weaker our motivation is to seek it. That's how it works. Present bias means that because we are delayed in getting something, we tend to discount its value. So economists say, put simply, we'd rather have £100 today than £200 next year. Present bias. It even overrides logic at times. So logically, we all know we should save for a rainy day, or that's certainly how we express it in English. Put aside a bit of money for the future. But as a culture, as a society, we don't want to live that way. We'd rather spend what we have today, and if anything, we'd rather spend more than what we have today and build up debt for the future rather than savings. It's why we don't start to invest in a pension in our 20s, because we think, what's the point of that? That's like 40 years before I'd ever see any of that money. Present bias. Saving money, of course, gets even harder when our culture reinforces present bias. Our culture says it's better to have something today, even if it costs you more, than wait for it for tomorrow. There's a pull on us in our culture to live for today. And so society has to work hard, and those who think we ought to be saving for our pensions and all that have to work very hard to persuade us to behave differently. So one study looked at the results of a 2-year experiment. It involved 2,700 people. They took 2,700 people and they put them into 3 groups. One group was simply told, for every penny you save over these 2 years, we will pay you 5% interest rather than the typical 0.3. That's all they were told. You'll get more money at the end. Save into this account. The second group of people weren't offered any higher rate of interest. They were simply put into a peer group of fellow savers. So you could imagine a club or a society. Imagine this is a savings club, and we come in today and we sit around the table and we discuss how much we've saved in the last month and therefore how much we've saved in total. And we all kind of pat each other on the back and give each other a round of applause because we've done it. A self-help peer group. And then the third group weren't given a self-help peer group. The third 900 people, they weren't given a higher interest rate. They weren't given a peer group. They were given an app for their phones. They were given a virtual savings buddy, an app that would respond to their savings by encouraging them and reminding them it's time to put aside a little bit more money. It's been a while since you've saved anything or whatever. And what the economists found is that people who were simply offered a little bit more money at some point in the future saved no more than they would have done otherwise. So that first group, no more. But the second group and the third group saved, on average, typically 3.5 times as much money as the first group. In other words, simply saying, but you'll get more money in the future, didn't seem to win people over. They couldn't save and convince themselves to behave differently. What they needed was support from other people and reminders. And then they did choose to think about the future more than they would have done and to save 3.5 times what the first group chose to do. Present bias has a strong hold. It can be really difficult to overcome. And nowhere do you see that more than I would suggest than in the lives of Christians. It's Christians who suffer more than anybody else with present bias. And we're going to see why as I go through the talk a little bit later on. And we're going to see it's because of what we as Christians would claim to know about our futures. And yet how we choose to live in the present. There's a greater disconnect between what we profess to be our future hope and what we live than perhaps someone who thinks, well, I'm only here for 60, 70 years and then I die and then that's it, no more. Present bias is a real problem for us in growing up and going on if you're a Christian here today. And I appreciate we're not all Christians here, but if you are a Christian, I want to address that issue. And actually, in this series as a whole, this is what we want to think about between now and Easter. We want to be thinking about how can the future really impact the present to shape and change the way we think, the way we pray, the way we give, the way we work, everything that we do. Because it's not just financial planning that we're affected by. There's a spiritual present bias that affects us too. You see, if you're a Christian, you know, or would say you knew, deep down, 2 things. Well, more than 2 things, but the 2 things I want us to think about today. There are 2 things that you sing about. There are 2 things that you celebrate. There are 2 things that if you grew up as a Christian, you knew from Sunday school. Here's what you know. You know that you have an eternal home, a future with Jesus Christ in heaven, and that you know that it's both certain and glorious. Those are the 2 things you know about your future. You know that in one sense, this life is as of nothing compared to the next life, because you have a future in heaven that is sure, not because of who you are, not because of anything that you've done, but because of Jesus through his perfect death and his resurrection from the dead has promised that if you put your trust in him, he will take you to be where he is, and he tells you it is better by far. Jesus is the one who tells you you've seen nothing yet compared to the future. You know you have a future. It's certain because it's all about what Jesus has given you through faith in him. And you know it's glorious because it's the same Jesus who has come from that heaven who tells you that it is better by far than anything you've seen or experienced in this life. And yet, it is surprisingly easy to know those 2 things and for our lives to be largely untroubled or unaffected by it. Well, Lydia's going to come up now and read a parable about present bias. Now that we've talked about what the economists discovered in that experiment, let's see it in Jesus' own words and his example. Thank you, Lydia.
So the reading's on page 1045. So that's Luke chapter 12, starting at verse 16. So page 1045, Luke 12, verse 16. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool! This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich towards God.
Okay, so now we know a little bit about where we're going, and we've just heard something in Jesus' own words. What I'd like us to do around our tables, just for a few minutes, is ask ourselves this: do we think we do as a culture, and even as Christians in our culture, if you're here as a Christian, do we think we suffer from present bias? In other words, are our lives consumed with the here and now? Okay, present bias. And then secondly, would you say you ever really thought about heaven at all? And do you think it impacts how you live now? Do you ever think about heaven at all? And does it impact your life? We just read a story there that Jesus tells about a man who had extreme present bias, didn't he? It was all about what he could earn, what he could get, what he could have now, to the extent that he gave absolutely no thought to the future, to his own death, to his own knowledge that he would one day stand before God and so on. So how about you? Present bias? Do you think we suffer from present bias? And secondly, how often do you think about heaven, and does it impact your life or not at all? Okay, just for a few minutes in your groups. Okay. Good discussions. Couldn't quite hear what was going on, but it sounded as if you were grappling with these ideas. I guess the goal of the series is to correct that present bias. Because if you look through the Bible and you look at the words and the teachings of Jesus, or you look at the example, the words and the teachings of someone like the Apostle Paul, you'd have to conclude, if anything, they had what was clearly a future bias. The future was what orientated their decision-making, their priorities, their attitudes and perspective on life. And their future had a powerful motivational force in their lives as Christians. So, for example, the Apostle Paul had this to say about the present and the future, and it really helped him to face up to his own sufferings, the downside and the difficulties of life. He said, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." It's very striking, isn't it? Very future focused. Look, life now is hard, but I have a future that is certain and glorious, and that sustains me. So I wonder whether sometimes it's actually in the face of adversity, difficulty, trial, suffering, Christians in countries where being a Christian is hard, and they have this future bias that we don't have here. Or how about this? I think this is where Paul puts it in its most strongest terms. Paul in Philippians chapter 1 says, "I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far." That's future bias, isn't it? It's better to be in heaven than on earth. And you think, how could I ever live my life here in Birmingham with that kind of perspective, that it's better to be in heaven than on earth? That's hard, isn't it? And I guess one of the things we grapple with in our tables is it's really quite hard to have that future perspective. But the future dominated Jesus' thinking, dominated Paul's thinking. The reality of Jesus and the new creation altered perspectives and priorities. So what we need is somehow our heavenly future to capture our imagination. I think that's what it would take. It was to be alive to the future, for it to function, to have real, be like a heartbeat in our hearts and in our lives. And that better grasp of the future, that clearer understanding of the future, would then really change how we thought about the present. I guess what I'd really love to be able to do, and love for us to be able to do, is say, come here next Sunday, 4:00, we get to go on a bus trip to heaven for a day. Imagine, you could say, that's what we're doing next Sunday. You know, bring your best clothes, we're going to heaven for a day. Do you think in coming back you would live differently? I think you'd have to, wouldn't you? If it was that glorious, if it was certain and glorious, you'd come back and you think, my perspective on this life has changed. It's like when you've only had a black and white TV. Some of us are old enough to remember that. Only ever had a black and white TV. And then you go to a mate's house and they've got a colour TV. And then you have to come back to your own black and white TV, and basically you just think, well, I didn't know any different. This is the only TV I had. I thought it was all right. And now I've seen the future, and I think, boy, I can't wait. Mum, Dad, when can we have one of these? Whatever it might be. Because you've seen something of the future, and it comes back into the present. So I'd love for us to be able to get on a bus, but I don't think that's going to happen. I'll confirm that. Let's see if Terry can arrange it, but I don't think. He'll give it a go, won't he? He'll try. He'll definitely try. You need to know where you're heading for it to have any impact on the present. So this is Gary Larson's Far Side cartoon, sort of gently mocking our Christian hope. This is kind of the way he sees it. There's a man sitting on a cloud. Wish I'd brought a magazine. I mean, how boring does heaven sound? We'll read the Far Side, and you think, yeah, well, that's kind of most people's view. I can't get a grasp of it. I can't get a feel for it. I can't get an appetite for it. It's completely unknown to me, or what I think of when I think about heaven just seems so otherworldly I'm not sure I even want it very much. But your future, when you read the Bible, is nothing like that cartoon, okay? Actually, your future, when you read the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, your future seems to be much more like this world than it does anything else. In fact, read Revelation and the end and chapter 21, which is where we were at City Church this morning. If you were there, you'll remember it, when we were there this morning. And actually, the new heaven and the new earth talks about God coming down to this world, perfected and glorified, and God making his home with us here. It's as if it's this world, but made brilliant, made new, made perfect. You will not be sitting on a cloud. You'll be living in a restored and perfected and glorified creation without sin, without suffering and death. So if your future hope is this world perfected, then actually you can start to imagine the new creation. Because what you start to think is, well, what was my best ever day in this world? Or what is it about this life that I love so much? And as you start to reflect and think on those things, well, if the new creation is everything you love about this world made perfect, then everything that you enjoy about this life isn't a disincentive to think about heaven, but actually becomes the very reason to think about heaven. Because you start to think to yourself, well, if today was a great day here in a fallen earth, and in a world marked with sickness and suffering and sadness, if today was a great day, what's it going to be like in a perfected creation? What difference could that make? Whatever reason you have for staying or wanting to stay in this world is actually a reason for leaving this world. Because heaven is just unimaginably better than anything and everything you've experienced in this world. C.S. Lewis wrote a letter to a lady who was old and frail. She was nearing her death. In fact, so was he, but he didn't know it. He was 6 months from his own death. And this is what he said to her in his letter as she struggled with the idea of her own mortality and dying. He said, "Has this world been so kind to you that you should leave it with regret? There are better things ahead than any we leave behind." So don't regret leaving this life. The future is better than anything you've experienced here. Just like when you've seen that colour TV, you don't go back to your own black and white TV and think this is better. You think, no, I've seen the future and it's glorious. Let me suggest then, just as I finish and we talk around the tables, we just want to start thinking about this theme today. But let me just suggest a couple of things that I think will help us a little bit today and then as we go on. So here's the first one. If you're struggling to grasp how heaven can motivate you, first one is whatever you enjoy in this life, in some way will be perfected in the next. Even your sin, dare I say it. Because in the new creation, everything that you looked for, even from sin, is actually a gift of God that can be actually used beautifully in service and worship of him in the next life. All sin is a desire to have a good thing, but in a bad way, in some form or another. We can talk about that later if you want to. So when we find it difficult to want heaven, we need to rethink heaven. So C.S. Lewis again. The real want for heaven is always there within us. Listen to what he's saying. It's always there. Your desire for heaven is always there within you. It's just that you don't recognize it. Most people, if they'd really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, or first think of some foreign country, or first take up some subject that excites us, are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I am not now speaking of what would ordinarily be called unsuccessful marriages or holidays or learned careers. I'm speaking of the best possible ones. There was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing which just fades away in reality. I think everyone knows what I mean. The wife may be a good wife, and the hotel and sceneries may have been excellent, and chemistry may be a very interesting job. I'm not sure about that, but you tell me if it is. But something has evaded us. Lewis goes on to say, what do you do when the things that you long for, that your life touches on but fails to live up to, what do you do when you have those experiences? You can only do three things, Lewis says. Here's what you can do. Number one is play the fool and insist it is here in this life somewhere, and it's just the experience I've not yet had. So it's winning the lottery, it's falling in love, it's when the kids or the grandkids come along, it's the bigger house, it's whatever it might be. You think it's just around the corner in this world somewhere, it's fame, it's whatever it could be. And he says that's to play the fool, because every time you thought it was the next thing, you were always disappointed. It gave you some happiness, but it never satisfied, and you thought it's the next, it's the next. He says it's a foolish thing to think it's in this world. So that's play the fool. Or option number two is just become quite cynical. And so actually the things that are happiness, well, I don't think anyone could ever be happy. You just become disillusioned, cynical. You know, I've tried it, I've been happy, I've had moments, but I don't think anyone can really be happy ever. So you could become cynical. Or the third option is to see these longings as pointing us to the new heavens and the new earth and the promise that God has made to us in Jesus Christ, so that the Apostle Paul can say, I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. You can be a fool, you can be a cynic, or you can grow as a Christian. Actually, these very longings will never be fulfilled in a fallen world. But come, Lord Jesus. When you bring in your perfect world, and there'll be no more sickness and sadness and suffering and death, then I will be happy. So Lewis says you've always had a hunger for heaven. Your problem is you very often thought it ought to be realized now here on earth, and through someone or something other than Jesus. C.S. Lewis is saying it's not that you've never desired heaven. He says actually that's always what you've desired. You just didn't know it. And you thought it was something in this world. So being a Christian in part means making that connection between the things that we love about life and allowing them to feed that appetite for heaven, allowing ourselves to glimpse or have a taste of heaven through the things that we enjoy. It's a story I've told a couple of times before, but I remember being on a Christian holiday with friends, and at the end of a really great day, there was a beautiful sunset. And I said, wow, look at the sun over there. And my friend, who's much more godly than me. His response, he just said, "Come, Lord Jesus." And I thought, we're talking about the sunset. Yeah, we'll do a Bible study later. I'm just saying it's really nice. The sun looks really nice. And the more I've thought about it, the more I thought, no, he's just doing what C.S. Lewis says to do. Just take the good things in life and allow them to point you to perfection. Say, well, if that was good, how much better will a sunset be in a perfect world that Jesus has promised to bring about? And I understand a little bit more clearly what he's saying than I did back then. Let your appetite for heaven grow. And then secondly, or more briefly, if you're struggling to grasp heaven, don't not only look at the things you like in life and enjoy in life and the good things and allow them to feed your appetite for heaven, but secondly, recognize that your relationship with Christ will be perfected in the new creation. So the end of the book of Revelation, the promise is that God will be with us, that Jesus will walk amongst us, that the one whom we love from afar we will see face to face. So in one sense, what we have to do is try and really draw near to Jesus. And the more we want Jesus, the more we'll find we want heaven, because that's where he is. Ask anyone who's married, was it better when you were engaged? Is engagement better than marriage, or is it the other way around? I've not met anyone who says, oh yeah, engagement's amazing. Yeah, I'm not sure why I ever got married. I should have stayed engaged. And yet, if it's the same thing about the Christian hope. If we think, well, is it better to know Jesus through faith by his Spirit, or is it better to be with him, to eat a meal with him, to talk to him, to share the new creation with him? Of course it's better by far. I desire to depart and be with Christ, is what Paul says. So how will our appetite for the future look different from the Gary Larson cartoon? Well, let the pleasures of life tell you how great heaven is, and let your own relationship with Jesus grow, and you think, well, I do love Jesus, and I want to be where he is, and therefore heaven and the hope of heaven grows in our hearts. And of course, just like that experiment, remember the 3 groups encouraged to save? The peer-to-peer group saved 3.5 times more than people doing it on their own. Well, as you encourage one another to think about heaven, so that will help that hope to grow in your heart. And as that app was pumping out those reminders to that group to save, so as we remember our future through talks like this, through reading the Bible for ourselves day by day, so that appetite will begin to grow as well.